everybody, this is Nora. I'm happy to be here with you crafting today. We have a really wonderful project. We're going to be deconstructing fabric to make placemats. Now, I've never deconstructed fabric before, and to me it feels a little bit sinful because you're taking this beautiful large floral print with these wonderful colors, and I'm going to cut it all apart into pieces, and I'm going to try and make them all random pieces so that I am not fussy cutting, as they call it, but I am instead just going to see where the cutter lies and just live with that, and I think it'll be random and exciting. So hopefully it will come out beautiful. We'll see, but let's get started. So here we are ready to cut, and there's a couple of things that I should mention. Number one, I'm already feeling a little anxious about cutting up this beautiful fabric. So typically what I would do if I were to be making placemats is I would take one of these, large flowers or some of these smaller busy flowers, and I would cut a nice big piece, and then I would put a border around it and sew it up, and that would be the placemat. But as I mentioned, I'm going to be cutting these up into tiny pieces. So I hope that I'm going to move forward with that plan. And I hope it's cool. I think it could be. I think it will be. And so what I'm going to do is line this nice and even with my ruler and my rotary cutter. And I'm just going to cut a straight line. Here's my trick. I have a cutting square. I think this is a 5.5-inch square. But what I use is when I line this up with the 3.5 mark, even if I line up all my lines, sometimes by the time it gets to the top of the ruler up here, it's a little bit off. And so what I like to do, and let me adjust the camera here so you can see, is I like to push this ruler up to the 3.5 mark, right there, so that I know that my lines are nice and even. And now that it's all lined up, I'm going to cut. And then I'm going to move the fabric down and do the same thing a little farther up. Make sure the fabric is nice and straight. And here, I usually don't need my other square tool because I can line it up on this line that I've already cut and then go to the top. See how you can see the top of the numbers up there? I can line that up with the 3.5 mark at the top, so I know that this is nice and straight all the way up, and I can just cut. Now I'm going to do that for the whole fabric and see how many squares I get. We'll cut that in a minute and fold this over like we did with the last one, and we'll start again. Continuing to cut 2.5-inch strips, and then when we have our 2.5-inch strips, we'll cut those strips down into squares. And here, I don't have to keep moving my fabric back over to the line. I cut this, the 2.5 inches, and now I can just move my ruler over another 2.5 inches. Okay, so now I have my strips of fabric here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to lie some of them on top of each other. I'll just start with 2. I don't want it to get too thick because it makes it difficult to cut through, but I want to make sure that they're right along the lines of my cutting board so that they won't be, I want an exact 90-degree angle. So if it's diagonal when I cut it a little bit, it won't be exactly square. So we want to make sure it's right on the line. And we're going to keep cutting. We're going to cut these strips into 2-inch squares. 2.5-inch squares, actually. Okay, here's our first 2 squares. Let's see which ones they are. Okay, this is cool. So look at that beautiful curved line of the dark blue and the light blue with the very, very dark, or maybe even black. I think it's like a navy strip across there, and then these little bubbles. It looks like it's a sky with a hill or something. This is totally random. This is just the first one, and then there's a tiny pop of color in the bottom. So this is just beautiful, and this is exactly what I was hoping for. Let's see what this one is. So this one is going to be very similar to this one in color because they were right next to each other, but it's also very different, right? But it also oddly looks like a sky to me. Here's the hills, right? Maybe there's the moon and some stars, but very beautiful. So I can't wait to keep cutting these and see what I get. I'm going to go on to my next strip. 2 strips. I'm going to cut 2 strips at the same time. Okay, so I have cut all of the pieces. In fact, I cut more than I had initially said because unfortunately I had intended the squares to be 2.5 inches in diameter. However, I did not allow for the seam allowance, and the seam allowance is going to be 1/4 on each side. So that would be 1/2 inch total. So now the squares are in fact going to be 2 inches each when they're done. However, that means I needed more squares than I thought. But the good news is that I had plenty of fabric. So I ended up with a total of 140 squares. So that is 35 squares per placemat. And I ended up with all of this extra fabric. I have a bunch of strips here, so that's great. I can do something with those as well. So in looking at this, I'm not as excited about it as I had initially hoped. I just randomly put these pieces in all kinds of different spots. And so I can mix these up. Like these 2 are too similar, so I would want to maybe switch some things around. I haven't touched anything here yet. And these 2 are pretty similar, so maybe moving these around, and that's the fun part. But I'm thinking that what it needs, what would make me happier with this, because I really did love the initial fabric, but once you cut, you're done. So what I think would make me happy is if I did put borders in between each square. And I think that would make it really frame each individual square so that each square is kind of its own piece of art, is what I'm hoping there. So I need a little bit of fabric. I need to go find some fabric for the borders, and then I'll need to find some fabric for the backing. So let me go do that, and then we'll see what I find. I'm back, and I really didn't want to buy any new fabric for this project. I wanted to do the whole project with fabric I had on hand. So let's just see what I found here. I found a couple of different things. I'm not sure what will work, if anything. I always seem to have to take a trip to the fabric store. But this is interesting in that it has a lot of the same colors as these pieces. So you'll see the purple here and the purple here, and kind of the navy here and the navy here. And this blue is really similar. So that's a really nice one. The pink kind of throws it off a bit, but that would be an option. This is just kind of a wild and funky print. And as you can see, it's just all different colors. And I think some of the colors are likely in these squares, but other colors aren't. And maybe this could be a good, well, the squares got stuck to the back. Maybe this could be a good backing, but it might just be too wild. The front is very wild, and maybe we just want to rest our eyes in the back. Then I have this cool sunshine fabric, and this really picks up a lot of the colors. This picks up the yellows beautifully. There's some of that teal in the eye of the sun. You see the eyes are kind of teal, and same with the picture. So that could be good for a backing. But again, this is a really specific fabric, so I don't know if it would take away from the front. So I might want something a little more plain. I brought down this green polka dot. I'll get a closer look. So these are like kind of watercolor like dots, but it's not really picking up any of the colors in the, a little bit in the center of this flower here, but besides that, it's really not picking up. There's a little, that green there. But I'm not in love with that. I'm not in love with that one. I have this plain green. And this might be good for the back because it would kill some of my stash. So this is a piece that that is nice, but I'm not crazy about. And so this is the kind of piece that's nice to use in the backing instead of something like the suns, which would be beautiful, but would really be, I could use that for a project that you would see more of it more frequently instead of just the back of a placemat. So maybe just that green would be nice. Yeah, maybe this would be good for a border. This is a batik, and batiks are fabrics that are kind of watercolor looking, and so this picks up some of the nice navy colors in there, and that would be really nice for the borders of each square. But I don't know if I have enough of this. I did get this in case I don't have enough of this. So they're not the same, but not everything has to be perfect. I kind of like when things aren't perfect. So I could just use some of each. So let me think about that. And then I need to cut some strips to act as borders for each piece. And then once I've cut those, we can get out the sewing machine and we'll sew together. Now I have some of these little strips cut. And again, these are 1 inch wide and then a little less than 3 inches long, a little more than 2.5. And what I'm going to do is, this is just a scrap piece of fabric I have here just to get the sewing machine going. But I'm going to pair one of these strips and randomly just put it on any side of the fabric. And just start sewing these together. You're going to sew 1/4 of an inch in. And then you're just going to feed another one through. So again, I'll pair the strip with just any random side on the fabric, line it up, and your strip will be a little bit longer than your square because we'll trim them later, and you sew 1/4 of an inch. And just keep going. I have a couple that I already put together here to make it go a little faster. And you keep going. Now, when you've done a bunch of those in a row, you can just cut the pieces. Here's my scrap again, which I'll put back under my machine. And then you just cut these off. Okay? And you put them in a little pile. Now I should mention that before I started sewing my squares and my strips, I ironed both the strips and the squares. That makes sure that you can line them up nice and even so that they're not bumpy, and you want a nice clean edge because since we're working with straight lines, the more you can press, the better. So now that I have these done, I'm going to go to my ironing board and I'm going to press these seams open. So instead of just finger pressing, and you could just finger press and then go to your next one. And you would line it up like this, Okay? So you don't have to go back to your ironing board if you don't want to, if you want it to go a little faster. And then you can keep it going here. And then I could take another strip and do the same thing. Take another square. But it's harder to line it up if you haven't ironed it. Things can get a little wonky. And you want to make sure that when you line it up with this strip, you're also lining it up with the other square, because if you line it up, for instance, with the edge of this strip, you're not going to be lining it up in the right place on the square, and you won't have a nice straight line. So you want to line it up in two places, right across the top here, and then right along both sides of the square. And so you would just do a bunch of these. So after you do a bunch of attaching the strips to the squares, I would do all of the strips to the squares and just get them done. Then you would press them open, and then you'd come back to your sewing machine and you'd sew the second square on. So now you have a bunch of 2 squares with the seam in the middle. Okay? And then do all of those. Now this part, you definitely need to press at this point, because things are going to start to get a little uneven if you don't do that. And so I'm going to do that now. So here are some strips of 2, nice and ironed and pressed, and that's looking really good. Look at this one here with the orange and the yellow and the little pops of pink. That's really beautiful. So my placemats are going to have strips of 5 squares down. So this needs to turn into a strip of 5 squares. You want to create a bunch of these strips with 2 squares. However, you don't want all of yours to be 2 squares, because if everything is 2 squares and you're attaching them together, you're going to end up with strips of 6. And you don't want 6, you want 5. So I would say do a bunch of these with the 2, and then start attaching a single one. So I have a single one over here, and I think I won't put this one up here because those will be 2 together. I'm going to put this one down here. And I'm going to align the batik and then right down the side. It might take a little adjusting, and then I'm going to sew. Okay, and normally I would do a bunch of those, but let's take a look at what this looks like. Now I have 3, and after I have 3, I want 5. I want to end up with a total of 5, so I'm going to attach one more. I'm going to attach one more strip of 2, I should say, so you'll have a total of 5. Let's see how this is looking. Nice and lined up. You want to check both sides. Okay, we're going to sew that. And again, you can just keep going. To save a little bit of time. Attach a single to this one. And I try and do this as random as possible, but if there's 2 that are going together that are too similar, I'll use a different one. And so then once you have a bunch of these, kind of clip them off and see what you have. So it looks like I have here, I just sewed a 3-piecer. I have a 2-piecer over here and another 3, and then here's my 5. This is the first one. So that's beautiful. So here's the 5. So this one I would put aside. This one is pretty much done until we need to iron it, and then we'll attach a batik blue border to each side. But that's kind of the idea. So you just keep attaching these pieces. You know, so the next step, I would take this and I would attach it here, right? And then just keep going. Good morning, everybody. I'm back, and I sewed all of the strips together last night. Take a look. Here's one of them. I think it looks great. I'm really excited, and I tried not to have any that were exactly the same next to each other. and I'm really, really happy with this. I wasn't sure how I was gonna like this when I first cut out all the squares. I was feeling a little regretful for a moment, but now that I'm seeing it all come together, I'm really excited. So behind me, you can see on the table, I've lined up all of my strips next to each other, and let's go and take a look. All right, so last night when I sewed all of these together, I made sure to press them, really nice press afterwards. So the next step is going to be to sew these batik strips, the ones that I cut, in between each of these strips. Now before that, you want to make sure to trim the edge, right, of each of these. So we're going to trim the edge of this, we'll do that together, and then we'll sew on the sashing pieces to make the little squares. And then we will have the tops of our placemats. All right, so let's do that. Let's do some cutting and some sewing. All right, so here we are with our cutting mat, our ruler, and our rotary cutter. Okay, and I'm just going to go through and take the top piece. What you want to do is you want to line these squares up with the edge of this line, the edge of this yellow line. And then you're going to put the ruler over to also line up with that yellow line. And cut. And actually my ruler slipped a tiny bit there, which you want to avoid. And so I'm just going to trim this top piece again from here. Okay, there we go. So that's a nice straight line here, right? And so you might be wondering, for the batik fabric, why not just cut it to be the exact length? And then that would eliminate the process of having to cut right now. However, if you did that and you made them the exact same size, as you're sewing and piecing them together, they're never going to be lined up exactly right. And so you'll still have to trim, but you would have to trim a little bit farther into the square. And so leaving that extra space just gives you a little bit more wiggle room. So let's do it again. So you're going to turn it around, line it up, and trim. Look how nice that is. It's a nice, clean line. And then I'll put that strip to the side and do the next one. So here's an example of why it's really important to iron constantly when you're piecing pieces together, like quilting for various projects. This is officially called quilting, even though we're making placemats, we're not making a quilt. But I'm going to show you why it's super important. So I'm going to see if I can get you a little bit closer here. But I'm trying to line up, I don't know if you can see this very well, but I'm trying to line up with this yellow line. And I'm hoping you can see that down here I'm going over a little bit. Here, let me scooch this up a bit. I'm going over the 16-inch mark here and over the 16 mark here, but in the middle I'm going under it, right? It's not completely straight. And my guess is that late at night I got a little tired of ironing and I just went for it and sewed anyway. And now I'm paying for it. Now I don't think in the end this will make a huge difference, and I am just going to line my ruler up the best that I can right here and cut, and I'll be losing a little bit of my square here and a little bit of my square here, but I think in the end project it'll be okay. It would just be better if everything was a little bit more even, and quilting, that's super important. So iron, 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 iron. So this one is pretty off. This one is more off than just a little bit, and I'll see if I can show you here, okay? So here's the yellow line that I'm supposed to be matching up, and you can see that it hits right about here, okay? And then it's right on the yellow line. It goes off a tiny bit down here, which I'm not too worried about. It's pretty good, and I would leave that. However, you can see this here is totally off. It's hard to see, but this side here is a little bit thinner. This side here is a little bit thinner than this over here. This is thicker. So I think I might seam rip this and re-sew it on. And that's okay to do, right? Sometimes that kind of thing happens, and that's okay. We make mistakes, and sometimes we can fix them, and sometimes we can't. But in this case, I can fix this, and I can make it a little bit better, and then I'll come and I'll cut the edges off, and I'll be happier. So I'm gonna go do that. I'm gonna actually take it out of two seams. I'm gonna take it off of this seam, and then the one just right next to it. And then I'll re-sew those two seams, and I think that will help. We'll see, but I think that will make it better. And normally I wouldn't. Normally I would just let it go, but it was off enough that I think that's when the final product can start getting a little wonky. If it's too off. If it's a little off, it's okay, just leave it. But if it's pretty off, if it's more than 1/8 of an inch off, you should probably try and do it again. And I don't mind seam ripping. I find it to be kind of meditative and gives you a chance to think about your project and what your next steps are and that kind of thing. Okay, so I have my 3 pieces here. I'm going to sew them back together. Well, first I'm going to iron them. Super important. It's probably why this happened to begin with, is I probably didn't iron it. I know I ironed a lot of them, but I also know I probably didn't iron some, and this is probably one of them. So I'm going to iron these 3 pieces. I'm going to sew them back together, and then I'm going to come back here and let's see if that helped. And it did on this side. Let's check the other side. Oh yes, that's much better. Okay, good. Now we can keep going. Hello. Good, how are you? Yeah, what makes you say that? What makes you say that? Yeah, some of I should have been ironing more. It's okay, it'll be fine. Okay, I finished cutting all of the strips. That took a long time. So they're all done, they're all cut, and so the next step is going to be, let me get a strip over here. All right, here's our strip, okay? And we are going to lay these out, and we want to put a strip in between. Let's make sure you can see. In between each here, and that looks great. Let's take a look at that. That is going to be beautiful. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to cut all of our strips, which I've actually already done. I cut all of these strips last night, and I did not have enough of the batik fabric, so I did use that other fabric. Let's see if I can get a piece of it. Here's a piece of the other fabric. But I think it looks super similar. I think it will be really cool that you can just kind of notice a little bit that these are different, and I think that's super neat. And I don't want everything to be the same. I don't want everything to be cookie cutter. I want things to be interesting. So this makes it a little bit more interesting. And it meant I didn't need to go buy more fabric, so that's a plus as well. So cut all of your strips, and I cut them, how much did I cut them? I cut them about 13 and a half inches long, 13 and a half inches long. And that's more than you'll need, which is good. So when you line them up here, you'll have a little bit extra on the edge, on the top and the bottom. And then we'll trim it just like we did with the strips. We'll trim the full placemat. So I should mention that I put a strip at the top, but not at the bottom. So that means that when we have our strips on each side, we'll need to do a strip along the bottom, but not at the top. So that's just something to keep in mind, and I should have mentioned that earlier when you were putting these together. But in case you were wondering, there's one at the top, not at the bottom. And this is what I did. I sewed the border right along the edge, and look how nice. You can see how that's starting to make really pretty frames. Just like that. So what I'm going to do, and then I pressed, of course, with the iron, so nice and flat, And so what I'm going to do is take, let's see here, take the next one, line it up, and I'm going to sew right down this line so that when I open it, these two will be attached with the border in the middle. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. Okay, let's see here. This looks great. Excellent. So I'm going to just keep going. Some of these intersections, let's say, here and here, this one lines up really nicely, right? So everything is nice and even. It's a perfect X. Now, some of them don't, right? That one here is not even at all. But that's okay. That's okay. This one's really not even either. But that's okay. I think when the placemat is complete, it won't be very noticeable. And the important thing will be to make it nice and even all around the edge. So we'll use our ruler and rotary cutter and make it really nice and perfectly even so that it's a perfect rectangle. But the goal is to have these kind of intersections. If you're shooting for a goal, this here is the goal. Okay, so everything almost is sewn together for the toppers. So what we have to do now is we need to trim, see if I can show you, this bottom part, to trim that off, okay? So the bottoms of each of these need to be trimmed, and then we need to attach a strip to the top. So I have these strips here, and I'll attach a strip to each of the top. I don't know if you can see that very well. There you go. All right, and once we do that, we'll be ready to put the backing on. Here is one of 4 of our placemat toppers, and I'm really excited about how this turned out. I think it's beautiful. So now we're going to finish the project, which I'm also very excited about. So I have also cut a piece for the back. I went with this kind of vine looking blue print, which I think is going to be really nice on the back. So I cut this to be the tiniest bit larger. I mean, just maybe 1/4 of an inch, if that, on each side, just to give me a little bit of wiggle room if I need it. So I cut 4 of these, and I have 4 of my placemats. Now, I also cut 4 interfacings for each top and 4 interfacings for each of the backs. And these are fusible interfacings. This is going to add a little bit of stability to the placemat. And these are fusible, as I said, so they iron on. So I'm going to do that now. So this is completely ironed on, and as you can see, it won't come apart. I could, peel it apart if I really had to, but I cut it a tiny bit smaller than the placemat. And this is a pretty heavyweight, I'd say this is medium to heavyweight interface, and you can get them lightweight, medium weight, heavyweight. But this is a little heavier than some of the other ones you'll find, but I think that'll be really good for a placemat feel. It won't feel too flimsy, so that's great. So the backing now has the adhesive on it now as well. So we have the front and the back. These are really nice and stable. They have a great feel to them. And if you don't have this fusible stabilizer, that's fine. You don't need it. You could just sew these together as is, and it would be a little bit more lightweight, which would be fine. So what we do now is we're going to put the right sides together. So we have the back and the front, and we put the right sides together. And remember, we cut the back a little bit bigger than the front. So when we go around on our sewing machine, we'll have the top on top, and we'll be able to kind of just see a little bit and have a little bit of extra wiggle room if we need it. But we're gonna leave a little opening about this big right there. And then we're gonna flip it inside out and top stitch it. So you're really seeing 3 lines here when you're sewing this. You're seeing the line of the backing, you're seeing the line of the top piece, and then you're seeing the line of the interfacing. And you want to be following the line of the interfacing and sewing 1/4 inside of that line. And what we want to do is trim the edges off. So each corner, not edge, I'm sorry, each snip, just like this, right on the angle. All four. And now let's try and turn it inside out. Might need to make that hole bigger, let's see. Don't want to rip it. I've done that before on blankets, and it's better to make the hole a little bit bigger and not rip the fabric, because that's really hard to fix. But I think this should be fine. I'm going to need to go get something to poke the edges out. I'm going to give it a nice iron. Then I'm going to top stitch it. And when you top stitch it, that's what closes the hole. Okay. There it is. I am so unbelievably thrilled with this. I think this looks fantastic. I still need to top stitch it to close that hole, but you can really see what it's going to look like now, and I'm just thrilled. This is great. Let me do the other ones. I've sewed all 4 placemats and turned them right side out, and here is the hole that I'm going to need to sew shut by top stitching all the way around the border. Now, if I were to do this again, I probably would make my border bigger to give myself a little bit more room to fold in the sides of the opening. Because I only have about 1/4 inch, it's really difficult to fold in these pieces, and I anticipate it's going to be challenging sewing this shut. I think it'll be okay, but in the future I would just give myself a little bit more room. So I'm going to go ahead, top stitch all the way around, and then I will be done. We have finally come to the end of our project. It took some work, but we did it, and I'm so excited. Look at how great these look. Here, I'll hold each one up. Let's see if you can see it. There's the first one. Really beautiful. I'll take pictures of these tomorrow in better light. It's nighttime right now, and so the lighting isn't great, but you can get an idea of how each one turned out. And there's no right or wrong side, right? They could be upside down or right side up, and it both looks good. Here's the last one. So the closure did prove to be a challenge, and some of them came out better than others, but as we talked about, I would add a little bit extra fabric on the border next time to give myself some other room. But besides that, I think that these are really, really great. I love them so much. I was going to give them as a gift, but I love them so much that I want to keep them. And I may keep them. I think I will probably give them as a gift because I do not need more placemats, but I love them. So I'll take more pictures tomorrow, or take some pictures tomorrow. I've had a really fun time. I hope you have as well. And I cannot wait for our next project. I might just start it tonight. Bye.